Okay. Have you looked at moral development? Hello? Have you looked at moral development? If not, we can
Not,
just, yeah.
not.
Okay. Not really. Okay, I think I had mentioned it, but we hadn't come to that particular area. So where we left off the last time, we were looking at the introduction to ethics. And I think along the way, for some people, it got too ethical and it had nothing to do with ICT. But I'm just asking, bear with me. We shall begin to see as we have discussions where the relationship merges. After introduction, we're going to start looking at ethical theories. And from there, we shall begin discussions on where we see these ethical theories appearing, being visible in the field of ICT. But let's come to moral development. We had looked at quite a number of things the last time we met. We looked at the basic concepts in ethics. And I think we had looked at value. Let me just go back and see. We looked at social responsibility. No, we hadn't looked at value. We're going to see what value is. But there is such a thing called moral development. Everybody has different levels of development throughout their stages of growth. We're going to go through these one by one. The first is pre-conventional. So this is really at the childhood level. Then you have conventional. This is where the youth. Then the principled level. This is when we are adults. Let me see. Let me first. Sorry. I don't know if I've gone through all these. Let me first. Let's first look at how do we encourage ethical. So how do we? First of all, is by codes of ethics, and every organization will have a code of ethics. Generally, for employees, ICT can have its own. So the codes of ethics clarify what expectations, what is expected of an employee, how they expect to conduct themselves. Specifically in ICT, we have already seen some of these embedded in our ICT policies. For example, how do we use our email? How do we use the organizations or the corporations' ICT resources? How is an employee expected, and even expect an employee to sign against it? We also have something called whistleblowers, where you create a structure which enables employees to report unethical or illegal behavior within the organization. So this is it's also just one of the ways to encourage ethical behavior, to ensure that that things are being done in the right way at all times. So what is it that guides ethical behavior? One, there's a subject called ethics. Yeah. So this ethics is usually a standard of behavior that is usually found within an occupation, a trade, or profession. For example, we have heard about, we've heard about the medical code of ethics. For example, about keeping certain things confidential. For example, if I go to a doctor and he diagnoses me with a certain illness, he or she is not supposed to go and tell a third party what my illness is without consent. So, for example, if I found me with cancer The only person you should be telling is my next of kin or somebody you're referring me to for treatment. That kind of thing. That is ethics. So you will find it in professions. Some professions have, some don't. Morality is another. Yeah. And morality is usually driven by our culture, religion, philosophical backgrounds, anything that gives us a personal, that guides our personal behavior. Finally, it's the law. Yeah. So the law tells us what we should do when we are on the road, when we're dealing with other people. The law also gives us guidelines on ethical behavior. Now, before we get to the stages of ethical growth, let's look at another term, which is values. What are values? So we've had this term over and over again. Even in families, you say these are our family values. Maybe we greet when we see each other in the morning. We clean up after ourselves. We pray together, and so on and so forth. There are different families have different family values. Now, also corporations will also have values. So will individuals. Yeah. So will individuals. Now, those values help an organization or individuals make good decisions. The values basically guide our decision-making process. Yeah. So here we have a fair definition of values. You can go ahead and read further about it. Basically, it is, if you look at what Rockich says, it says it's a small number of core ideas. So the value is actually an idea. If I say, when I wake up, the first thing I should do is pray, it's an idea that I have. Probably an idea that, oh, let me give my day to God. Another person will say, oh, my core value is to first meditate. Another person will say, oh, the first thing I should do in the morning is drink a glass of water or a cup of water, warm water. That's a value. And it's an idea. And someone may say, I drink water so that I can cleanse my digestive system. That's the most important thing first. So it's an idea, and you see what is it that you find that is of highest value to you. So that is at an individual level. Now you can also have it at organization, at corporate level, at department level. So these core ideas guide people on how they should live. And usually they are shared by the majority of the people within a community. Now, remember also an organization is also a community. So that's basically the nutshell of what a value is. Now, this slide talks about values being shared beliefs by members of a culture. Now, this culture could be organizational or departmental level, but it can also go back down to the individual. So the value determines what is right and what is wrong. Doing what is right or what is wrong is what would mean by ethics. So we have different types of values. Some of them we've already seen. We've talked about moral values. The moral values which are normally shaped by maybe our religious beliefs, culture. Then we have competence values. Competence values. Now, this particular value is, the competence value is saying, I behave like this concerning this, but I wish to go to this level. So take an example. If one says, I don't read any books, I desire to read books. That's a competence value. I need to make an achievement every single year or every single month. That's a competence value where one says, I want to move from point A to point B. Then we have the personal values, values that are intrinsic to me as an individual. You may hear people say things like, oh, I used to care what people think about me, now I don't. Oh, I used to bother about winning arguments, now I just don't bother whether you. That's a personal value. Not necessarily a moral value or competence, but that's a personal value. Or you hear someone say, I used to bother about having so many friends, now I don't mind having none. That's a personal value. And those normally come depending on the experience one is going through at a particular point in their life. Then we have what we call social values. Those social values that make us one as a community. Yeah. For example, world peace. Or if now, right now, we are to get the opinion of everyone on the war on Ukraine. It represents a social value. Yeah. Those things that hold us together as humanity. Now, with value application, we do have certain challenges. But I hope you can hear me. The rain here is getting worse. Can you hear me?
Yes, doctor.
Yes, doctor. We're trying.
Hello?
We are trying to hear you, doc.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
We are trying to hear you quite well.
Okay, let me keep trying.
Okay, doc.
Now, application of values is a bit of a challenge. Why? Because you may have conflicting values. For example, my personal values may conflict with your moral values at a particular point in time. My personal values may conflict with social values. So at any given time, there is a conflict on values. So this is typical in the field of ethics where ethical beliefs differ amongst people. We have simple or whole values that can provide general guidance. Yeah, they're simple or whole values that can provide general guidance. For example, not to steal, not to kill. Those are simple. But then there are certain situations which need specific attention. For example, if we talk about healing, this encompasses abortion. So if you have a particular case, let's say of rape, that is very specific, and there may be a conflict where you say the rape victim supersedes the child in the womb. Or one who says, I don't believe the child in the womb is a human being. So their interpretation comes in. Values needing interpretation. Business values, that's another type of value. A business will have value, and of course, any business will have value pertaining to or in relation to its core business objective. Yeah? Its core business objective. For example, a business, one corporation may have its primary objective of profit maximization over and above even human welfare. That means they're ready to work their employees 24 hours without rest, without compensation, without anything. I remember I one time had a story of certain corporations in the US some years back, which were even making their workers wear pampers so they don't have to go to the toilets. So you see there a business value conflicting with a social or human value. Now, an organization can also decide to have business values that are also ethical in nature. Business values that are also ethical in nature. An organization can decide to have that. So, for example, again, let's bear in mind ethics differ. For example, in US and Europe, I'm sure you'd be able to find ethical values that are saying that we support diversity, meaning race, and also sometimes sexual orientation. That is a business value that would match with the social values of that corporation. But in Uganda, it may be different. So that would be an example of a business values, where the purposeful ventures of the service or product are part and parcel of the business value. Take an example in Europe and the US. If your business demonstrates that it is at any point against sexual orientation, then automatically you'll be blacklisted, or you might even be taken to court. So your business values are expected to match with the social values. So the business value, in other words, should be a strong belief that supports sustainable improvement in people's welfare. So we'll have a look at some characteristics of sustainability. I think we may have seen some of this before. When we think about sustainability, we first of all think of economic. So we've seen that in Europe and the US, if you don't hold certain social values, you may be blacklisted, or even your business, people may be called to boycott your business. So it goes hand in hand with the social values, what is currently going on at the time. Now, another big thing that is currently going on is environmental. We must think about the environment. Now, I remember the last time we met, one of the things one of the participants said was that he thought that we were going to be dealing with ethics in ICT. Now, this ethics is very much part of ICT. Let me give you an example of the social part. I'll give you, there was a situation that happened in Uganda back in the early 2000s. There was a concern for software developers in Uganda that they did not have a platform on which they could share experiences, or if they were trying to develop code or for any kind of technical support. So there was a donor agency from Canada which set up an email platform, and it was hosted in Canada. And this platform was to support software developers in Uganda, to help them provide technical support as they were developing software of whatever nature. So like any social platform, at a certain point, you get off the topic of software development and the topic gets to homosexuality. Now, being that this was in Uganda, of course, things went sideways when people began to speak against homosexuality. This is against nature, it's against our culture, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. So what happens? This was a platform that was being hosted in Canada, and Canada is pro-sexual diversity. So what happened? The platform was dissolved. It's simple to the point. Now you already see how social ethics affected an ICT platform, an ICT innovation. Something as simple as that. Let me give you another. The environment is now very, very key. We have now something called e-waste. Yeah? E-waste. I'm sure all of you have heard about it. And here ICT takes takes a bit, is the focal point. So imagine if you don't have e-waste encompassed in your strategy and your policy. To say that we'll get computers and that every 5 years we shall dispose of computers, and this is how we shall dispose of them, and in environmentally friendly way. Yeah. So you see already there, ICT is also already affected in the business world. You even have certain situations now where donors will refuse to fund a particular project to your organization, maybe because you don't have this environmental aspect or the social aspects. So the business values must be seen to reflect the current social concerns. Yeah, the current social concerns, not just about making money, but look at the current social concerns. Now, here we're going to look at the values and where they come in the development of individuals. So now we have this gentleman. We had just looked at his slide earlier. He gave an outline of the 3 levels of value development. He did research mainly on boys from affluent background. And there he identified the 3 levels of cognition, of recognition of what is right and wrong. So in the first stage, we look at the children, children conforming to rules. Why do children conform to rules? Normally, children conform to rules when they know there is punishment and obedience orientation. So take an example. I have a niece and a nephew, very young, 4 and 5 years old, and they usually get into fights. Oh, this one has done this. This one has taken my toy. This one pushed me. And sometimes you find them in a fully fledged fight. One bites the other one pushes the other one. And once tempers are flared and you bring in punishment, usually the tempers come down. The thought of punishment comes in. Then there's usually also the part when obedience is solicited. For example, when you tell them that if you promise to eat your food on time, I'll give you a sweet. So this is usually the first stage of obedience to values. Do not fight. If you fight, I will beat you. If you eat your food in time, I will give you an incentive. So the child does what is right based on the stick and carrot method. Yeah. Then we have the second stage, which is also still at the level of children. So here it's normally hoped that they will benefit something out of it in return. Eat your food and I'll give you sweet. Eat your food quickly, you'll be able to watch TV for 30 minutes, something like that. The second stage is the conventional stage. This one is usually other-centered. When we begin to recognize others around us. For example, if you notice the adolescents, this is the time they begin to recognize their peers, and I will adopt values depending on my peers, those who are around me. And this is a time of peer pressure. So it's a time when somebody picks up good or bad values, depending on the peers that they seem to idolize at the time. This is stage 3 and 4. So here, the primary concern is being nice and gaining approval, the peer pressure part. Yeah. So people are judged by their intentions and motives. this stage is followed by the fourth stage where there is law and order orientation. And here you see it mostly, especially when people are in school, especially boarding school, where you have rules and laws that maintain a certain social order. Now, you have a school, have a perfect example. You have a school with its rules and regulations. Then you have the social element, your peers, who have also their rules. There are those who will break the rules, and because you want to fit in them, you will follow the path of breaking the institutional laws and regulations. Then we have the final stage, which is the post-conventional morality. So here we have the higher principles of human conduct, where people are either following the Constitution or 10 Commandments. And here you have someone basically developing into their own. Yeah, somebody is developing into their own. So here a person is concerned about the social contract issues. You may find there are people who may decide to go political because the political part is the prevailing area. You see people being concerned about things like, oh, I should be married at this time, or I should have a child at this time, or I should have a job X, Y, and Z at this time, because that's the mantra that is being spoken at that particular time. The sixth stage, a person looks at universal laws, universal ethics. So here, the person is really coming into their own, so to speak. When they gain principles as individuals, I can do this, I cannot do this. I will not follow this path, even though the whole world is following that path. So typical examples of those, the highest level that we have seen are things like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther, Pope John Paul II, and Nelson Mandela. Those are typical who have reached the highest level, who are ready to even lay down their lives for the sake of what they believe. So that is one researcher. We have another one, Carol Killigan, who looked at the feminist point of view of ethics. And for her, she basically juxtaposed the women's point of view to the men's. And she said that men are usually, they follow moral reasoning, while women are more concerned with compassion, the sources of like what is more compassionate about this situation. I'm very doubtful about that, about her thinking. I think also a lot of times if we examine ourselves, be it male or female, reason comes in our ethical line of thought. But anyway, that was her research. And where she believed that men are usually duty and principle oriented, whereas the girls are more looking for compassion. They're looking for the care voice, desiring to maintain a connection, and so on and so forth. So in other words, they're saying women tend to minimize personal pain, to avoid separation and isolation, and often they are selfless in accommodating others. Those were her thoughts. So these are some of the suggested readings. Do you have any question? I had to do a lot of shouting at the middle there. Apologies. That's the current environment. But do you have any question before we move to the next topic? Do you have any question?
No.
Okay. Okay, I hope that gives some level of introduction on the subject of of ethics, the introduction to ethics. Now, the next thing is to introduce you to ethical theories. And we want to begin with, there are 3 types. If you remember from the lecture we had previously, we have the consequential, which is utilitarianism, deontology, and then which follows the golden rule of do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And then you have the last one, which is virtue. These are the 3 generic ethical theories. Again, they may sound very far removed from ICT, but we shall have a discussion at the end to see where application may come in for the different types. But today, as of today, we're going to look at utilitarianism. There are things that need you to think about, so I wouldn't want to bombard you with too much. So let me share the screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Doctor.
Yes, Doctor.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so we are going to look at the ethical theory of utilitarianism. Some of you may have heard of this before this term, and some of the things actually we may have encountered them in ICT literature, and you'll see that it's actually not really far removed. So what is utilitarianism? Like we said in the previous lectures, in some places they call it consequential theory. We decide what is right based on the outcome. So in other words, you know that if you've heard of the term, the end justifies the means. So in other words, if I need maybe to, let me give the simpler, the straightforward way of looking at things. If everyone likes Museveni, if the majority like Museveni, therefore Museveni must be the right ruler. If everyone likes sugar, it means sugar must be good. If everyone likes beer, means beer must be good. If beer makes 60% of Uganda's population happy, it means beer must be good. And you can go on, so on and so forth, all these. So the argument here is that utilitarianism actually moves one from one's own interests and takes into the interests of other people. So if, let us say, I believe beer is bad, but 60% of Ugandans say it is good, then therefore I'm obliged as Sheba to accept that beer is good because 60% say it makes them happy. Okay, 60% say it makes them happy. Do you have any comment? Sylvia, do you have a comment? No, let's move on. So we had said earlier, utilitarianism is consequentialist. So basically the question is, what good will come from doing this? What benefit can we expect? It's actually a perfect, the cost-benefit analysis is a perfect example of utilitarianism. Yeah, perfect example of utilitarianism. So you can't judge an action good or bad unless you look at its outcome. You can't judge an action good or bad unless you consider its outcome. So the moral worth of an act is dependent on its consequences. Now, a technical term comes in, Hinduism. hedonism. Do you remember, I think when we were doing research, we looked at an article that was looking at the hedonic reaction or level of hedonism that participants of a particular research were experiencing when they were using a particular ICT application. I don't know if you remember that article. Francis, you have a question or comment? Francis, you have a question?
Yeah. Question for clarification. I want utilitarianism is about looking at the outcome.
Yes.
Yes, Doc. Yeah, what I'm saying, you have said utilitarianism is about the outcome that determines the course of action. Then I would want a clarification. Is there scenarios someone does something without objectives? Because it's all about objectives, and objectives are tied to outcomes. And therefore they will determine the course of either good or bad. So for me, what I want you to kind of like maybe draw a line or clarify is the issue of objectives versus utilitarianism. Objectives of an action, or yeah, thank you.
Objectives of the person carrying out the act. Now,
yes, the intent.
The intention behind it. Now, Francis, when you look at other theories, you will realize that what you're asking for may fall under others. Take an example, virtue. If you look at just something as simple as virtue, someone may decide. For example, you find a young man who decides, I'm going to be a Catholic priest and I will remain single and celibate for the rest of my life. Is him being single and celibate going to give him pleasure? Most likely no. Yeah, it's a question of dying to oneself, a desire, because it's a natural desire. But that person would be dying to themselves. So what is that person's objective? Most likely that person's objective is holiness. Or look at the objective of a parent who goes without for the sake of the child. Does that give that parent pleasure? No. But it definitely gives him satisfaction. Now, Francis, what I'm trying to point out to you is that virtue would cover your question, but not utilitarianism. So now what we have to bear in mind, Francis, is that there are different ethical theories. We're looking at one by one. Your example may fall under virtue, but may not fall under utilitarianism. And we shall also later on see the negatives about utilitarianism, the criticisms about utilitarianism. Francis, I don't know if I've answered your question. While Francis is coming, let's hear from Trinom Jisha.
Yes, hello, doctor. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Mine is a bit tricky. The outcome that we are looking at, is it basically on me who is doing the act or the people around me? Because I can do an act and it's good for me, but it affects people around me in a bad way.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the thing about utilitarianism, we shall see later about that utilitarian calculus. They even have a method. It's about the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. That is the measurement by which they come up the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people. We shall see the method later on. But like already, as you're all pointing out, there already you can already see the criticisms, because you're wondering if it's about pleasure. Even when you say the greatest number of people, the greatest number of people might say, let's kill half the world population. Is that necessarily right? So they are, of course, these ethical theories, they have their criticisms, but they have their uses. On Moodle, I think I still kept that article there. There's an article which talks specifically about design of mobile applications. And if you look at design of most ICT products which are mass produced, they usually use utilitarianism as their guiding principle. What gives you the greatest pleasure? For example, mobile phones were designed to give you pleasure. Utilitarianism is basically the reason behind the design of things like mobile phones, or rather, sorry, not mobile phones, smartphones. Things like Apple. Apple was designed, actually they said that the underlying marketing strategy for Apple is that they design their products to make you feel the way you would feel if you were in an evangelical experience. You know, when there's a very good, very nice gospel song that is uplifting, that's exactly the same feeling that the Apple designers aim for their users to feel. That hedonic experience. So already you can see this is, it's already something that is very much active in the business worldview. It guides the business view, the business value most. It's one of the things that guides it the most. So, like we're saying, utilitarianism focuses on pleasure. Vincent, you have a question or comment?
Yes, Doctor. You can. I think you can continue. I'm failing to get the difference between the two.
Between
Hope
which
you're
two?
getting there.
Between which two?
Utilitarianism and hedonism.
Okay, they are one and the same.
Oh, okay.
Well, the emphasis, utilitarian, where I'm getting to hedonism, I'm bringing the emphasis of utilitarianism. It's about pleasure and happiness. The thing that brings the most contentment to one or more people. So basically, utilitarianism and hedonism says we want to get rid of pain and unhappiness. We want to get rid of pain and unhappiness. So utilitarianism basically goes hand in hand with hedonism. Now, Jeremy Bentham is the father of utilitarianism. And he says, nature is governed by two things, pain and pleasure. We want to avoid pain and we pursue pleasure. That was his, that was the beginning, the philosophical thinking behind utilitarianism. So the right or wrong is dependent on pleasure or pain. We have two more hands up, Vincent, then Goretti next. Goretti, you're the only one left with your hand up. Goretti, do you have a...
Hello, can you hear me, Doctor?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. But in the argument that utilitarianism focuses on pleasure and pain, also the people who say abortion, they will tell you that we are looking at bringing happiness to the mother who has aborted the unwanted child. But then, isn't it the same as, what should I say, indoctrination, because there is no happiness without a particular cost. As utilitarianism, count the cost that comes before the happiness, because when you say have an abortion to continue having a promiscuous life, because you can easily go and abort and continue being happy, having a promiscuous life, there's a cost of possibly ending up barren, losing your womb, or the pain. And many people who have had abortion can attest to it. The pain, both psychological and physical, that is attached to the abortion process. Does
Yes.
utilitarianism count the cost, or does it just simply count the happiness, of which even the pain is still part of the end product, so to say?
Okay, thank you, Gorita. I think you make a, I think you raise a significant part. I think what we're later on going to see about criticism, the criticism of utilitarianism. One, I think Francis raised it when he said, is it always that we are seeking what is at the end, or we have objectives for why we're doing something? Then now Goretti brings another point of who then, she's asking the question of who determines what is pain and what is pleasure? And is all pleasure good? That even someone else can raise that question. I mean, if I take drugs, narcotic drugs, like if I take weed and I take cocaine and heroin, that will make me feel good. For sure, there will be pleasure, but there's also going to be the consequence of addiction, which is grotesque and painful for those who are addicted. So who then is the judge of what is good pleasure and bad pleasure? Who then becomes the judge? What if I tell you eating stones is pleasurable for me? If I eat the stones, definitely my teeth are going to come out. Whereas psychologically, I may enjoy it, physically, it's causing me harm. Okay? Physically, it's causing me harm. This may be a psychological problem. What about those people who say, I would feel better if I was born a woman, but I would feel better if I was a man. Therefore, let me change. And like Goretti pointed out, the after effects of some of these things are not necessarily pleasurable. So Goretti's question comes in, those are some of the criticisms of against utilitarianism. Who then is the judge of what is good pleasure or bad pleasure? Who then becomes the judge? So this is the thing about ethics. Ethics gets you discussing. It's not that everything that we are saying is right and true, but it gives you a chance to now come in and critique. It like we said, utilitarianism. If we look at the design of most ICT products, especially ICT products for the masses, like smartphones, the guiding force behind them is utilitarianism. What is it that gives you the most pleasure? If someone gave you an iPhone and a Techno, and they say, which one gives you most pleasure as you use? All of you are going to pick the iPhone. And if someone gives you a future phone, these button phones, and a Techno, and say, which is the most pleasurable to you? You'll pick the Techno. Why? It's giving you pleasure. It isn't, the future phone can make the same phone call and end it, can also receive a phone call. The future phone can help you send text messages. We even now have future phones that go on WhatsApp. But ultimately, given the choice between a featured phone and a smartphone, you'll pick the smartphone. Why? Because it gives you more pleasure. That process of touching the screen, you're moving things with your finger, you can enlarge things by just moving your finger. That is pleasurable. That is the philosophy behind it, utilitarianism. What is it that can give you the most pleasure? Look at other business services that I can sit in my chair here and access my bank and move funds maybe to myself, to my family member, make transfers here and there. I can pay school fees seated. All those are geared to give me pleasure, to ease my life, to relieve my pain of getting out of my chair, maybe go pick a taxi on the main road, travel in potholes, go to the bank, withdraw money, go and bank it for school fees. They are reducing my pain. Everything is done with that ending point. So in other words, they're saying pain and suffering is repugnant to human nature. Pain and suffering is repugnant to human nature. Nobody likes to suffer. But however, there are things that of course point to the opposite. We've just finished the celebrations of Martyrs' Day, June 3rd. You had Catholics, Anglicans, even Muslims celebrating members of their faith who willingly accepted to be burnt alive. To be burnt alive for the sake of their faith. So these were people who embraced suffering for the sake of something good called faith. So in other words, what Freud says, this is Freud is I think he was a psychologist or something like that, who wrote a lot of things about human nature, a lot of theoretical beliefs. And so one of them is about pain and suffering. So, basically utilitarianism looks at pleasure versus pain. So again, we come back to the issue of hedonism and the utilitarian philosophy. Now, the principle is the principle of utility. What is utility itself? What does the term utility mean? That brings out the reason for where we bring out utilitarianism. Utility is we look at an object or an act and we see what benefit can this object give us. What benefit can this object give us? Take an example, you take a car. You want to buy a car and then you say, what will be its benefit to me? Well, it can help me move from point A to B quicker and more comfortable. That could be one objective. It can help me carry more people, which means more of my family members can move from point A to B. It can also help me carry more people who pay me money and I gain economic value out of it. So that's where the principle of utility comes in. So utilitarianism, the fact that it's based on only one principle of utility, it gives it a kind of absolutist perspective, that this is the only reason we do something. And already, some of you have already objected to that. We saw Francis, who said there are some people who do things out of objectives, not necessarily out of pleasure. Goretti also brought up the question of who then becomes the authority to define what is of pleasure. Another philosopher came up called Mill, he adds another element to utilitarianism. But based on these two, they developed what we call a hedonic calculus, a table of measurement. It was invented by Bentham to arrive at an exact calculation of the amount of pleasure to determine whether something should be pursued or not. So they said the greatest good for the greatest number. So what makes utilitarian appeasing is that it looks at how many people find this thing pleasurable. Unlike others, like for example, deontology, which has, this is the basic rule, whether you like it or not, it's the basic rule, the golden rule for all of us, whether we feel like it or we don't. Or virtue, which really looks at the individual. I may pursue a virtue that you as an individual may find ludicrous. For example, there are people in society who are vegetarian, and this person will absolutely not anything that is animal based. And then you find others who are great meat lovers. Any kind of meat, red, white, they will eat it and demolish it to the highest level. But the vegetarian has their values, and their values may be it's more healthy. Number two, it's less cruel to animals, more it is environmentally friendly, and so on and so forth. So the vegetarian may be the only one in a room, in a sea of people who love meat. People who basically love meat. But the what makes utilitarian pleasing is that it picks a certain action as good as long as it is followed by the greatest number of people. So these ones were all basically repeats. Now, this is another point that I had mentioned earlier. Basically, when you look at the hedonic calculus, it's basically the cost benefit analysis. So we look at how do we maximize pleasure with a maximum number of people. Let's look at the calculus itself. First of all, it looks at intensity. The more intense the pleasure, the better. Two, it looks at duration. The longer the pleasure, the better. Three is certainty. How certain are we that we shall receive pleasure? So this is where also Goretti's question comes in, certainty. Like if you look at the example of abortion, they will sell you an idea that will give you the greatest freedom, and then maybe in reality it doesn't give you that. So certainty is the other. Facility, possibility. The greater the chances that you'll gain pleasure out of it, the better. Then on how pure the pleasure is, the purer the pleasure is. So I don't know again who measures this pleasure. The extent, the greater the number of people that can experience this pleasure, the better. So that is the calculus for that, for the hedonic calculus. Francis, you have a question or comment?
Yes. I just wanted you to give me an example of deontology in everyday life, because there seems some clear lines.
Deontology?
Yes.
Not yet come. Okay, we shall have that discussion most likely tomorrow. But basically, look at the golden rule: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. So, for example, I may want to slap you in public. I may get the urge to slap. It may give me pleasure. But would I also want to be slapped in public? That is deontology. It's basically like a law-like ethical, yes. But we shall have
Thank you.
more discussion on that, most likely tomorrow.
Thank you.
Okay, so here are just some examples of some where you can measure the Hindoni calculus. The costs, you look at the benefit of going abroad. You may have an economic benefit, but you have the cost of leaving your family, which causes you more pain, which gives you more pleasure. Someone may say going abroad, the economic part gives me more pleasure than the pain of leaving my family. Committing oneself to marriage, you may have marital bliss, but you have loss of your freedom. So you make a cost-benefit analysis of those. Now, there are two kinds of pleasure. There are two kinds of pleasure. For Bethan, when he formulated the Hindoni calculus, he was looking at the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. So in other words, he was pulling out what we call the self-interest, where there may be an individual who says, for me, this is what gives me pleasure. Yeah. For example, if majority say keeping life is good, then that is what is good. Then if there's a loner who says killing is better, then we say that one is we said that one is the devil, that is ethical egoist. So we follow the group, the majority. Now, Mill, on the other hand, had a different view. For him, he says there are two types of pleasure. You have quantity and quality. Pleasure does not amount to pleasure. We may think only in terms of the flesh, but there's pleasure that we can gain from mind and spirit. Take an example. Look at the Buddhists, especially the Buddhist monks, who live a life of solitude, a life of purity, and also a largely vegetarian life, a life of non-violence, where they would even move worms out of the way while they are digging so they don't hurt the worm. Now, imagine that painstaking life definitely doesn't give pleasure to the flesh and the body, but it definitely gives them a lot of pleasure in terms of their mind and their spirit. Then you can also go further to others. So for Mill, he was saying there are different kinds of pleasure. There's one of quantity, there's one of quality. So he differs from his master, Jeremy, in that sense. Now for Mill, he says there are those who seek the higher pleasure, and there are those who seek the lower pleasure. The higher pleasure is that of the body and of the mind and spirit. The lower pleasure is that of the flesh and the body. Yeah, that was Mill's thinking. But while Betham, on the other hand, was looking at only pleasure and happiness as the end result. So you can also look at these examples where one would think of what will I buy, food, drinks, or should I buy theology books, pharmaceutical books, things like that. So it's a typical example of when one makes a choice depending on which gives me the greater pleasure. So here, let's come to the strengths and weaknesses of utilitarianism. What are the strong points of utilitarianism? Number one, it helps us move from the ethical egoism. We're looking at what the majority feel or what the majority gravitate towards. Now, second strong point is that the claim of utilitarianism that most people are gravitated towards pleasure has actually been observed and tested empirically. And I think if you've looked at especially quantitative research, this has really taken utilitarianism as its driving force. So it has actually been tested. Any person would automatically move away from anything that may be painful and move towards what is pleasurable. Any human being. The other thing is that utilitarianism provides an absolute, just one single absolute moral principle, which helps us to get answers quickly. Yeah, it helps to get us answers quickly. When we categorize pleasure, we move away from the simplistic viewpoint. So meal, the viewpoint of meal helps us to at least move away from the simplistic view of Betham. So it gives us something a little bit broader when we are using utilitarianism as our ethical theory. Then the hedonic calculus also helps us determine which course of action we should take towards pleasure or happiness. And especially for businesses, for the business point of view, which is looking to target the masses for the sake of profit maximization. So in other words, utilitarianism provides the ordinary person with a simple, straightforward method of making ethical decisions. It is seen to be a lot more flexible and sensitive to the majority. And you can read through all the others. Now, here are the weak points of utilitarianism. Knowing the exact consequences of our actions. I think Goretti gave us a perfect example. Some things may be pushed forward as saying this will give you good results, and actually it doesn't. For example, abortion may not necessarily give you the freedom you expected it to give you. Let's look at something like ICT and the different ICT platforms and innovations that are being pushed forward on the sole basis of pleasure. When you have someone addicted to social media, that's not necessarily pleasurable. When human contact is reduced because people are focused on these ICT devices rather than talking face to face. So in other words, it's a bit difficult to determine what the consequences of our actions are going to be. Now, there are certain things that a majority may support, but not necessarily are right. For example, I may murder or steal someone for the sake of getting food. That doesn't justify the means. So this is where the golden rules come in, deontology comes in and overpowers utilitarianism. Then the other point is, if we were to take utilitarianism as our principal theory to guide us, it becomes impractical because we have to begin measuring how much pain for every single act we are going to do. Now, take an example. I may have to take a shower in the cold weather. I don't have hot water. Taking a shower in the cold weather with cold water is definitely unpleasurable. But however, the result of me bathing is that my skin will feel fresher. But the act of bathing itself is not pleasurable. So if I took time to measure even some of the basics which I need to do, like take a bath, lay my bed, clean the house, things that are unpleasurable, if I took time, then I'd be wasting time, things that should be done. Now imagine that being applied in the business world, in the field of ICT, things that should be done. You're supposed to carry out a maintenance activity on the network. And then you feel that it's going to take up too much of my time. It's going to stop others from working at a certain time. And if you're going to measure all of that, yet this is something that ought to be done. It must be done. Otherwise, the network will crash. We don't have time to measure some things. The principle of the greatest good for the greatest happiness does not give justice to the rights of the minority. I think that one is clear enough. That statement already is clear enough. If the majority say we should kill all non-productive members of the population, then we have the right to kill the elderly and the young or the disabled, who are the minority. Then utilitarianism ignores the role of motive and intention. Motive and intention. Why am I carrying out this act? Why am I carrying out this act? So the act itself, the motive and intention, determine whether an act is good or bad. Then there is also the thing we know as moral duties. Yeah, moral duties. Where you have a right, you have a duty. Take an example. I have a right to vote. Therefore, I have the moral responsibility of actually voting. I have a right to life, but I also have the moral responsibility of taking care of my life. I cannot say I have a right to life, then I sit back and say, someone feed me. Someone take me to hospital and take care of me. I don't want to do it myself. I am of sound mind and everything. So the moral duty is the thing that is neglected by utilitarianism. And you can go on further and read further onto it. I wouldn't want to spoon feed you on everything. Now, do we have any question so far? Francis, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, mine is a comment. I'm kind of like seeing deontology being somehow a subset of utilitarianism, though not exactly end to end, because if deontology deals with something that is generally accepted, what the masses really accept to be true without harm, then there could be those actions or intentions that actually give the best pleasure and they are generally accepted. So I don't know what your thoughts are in that respect.
I think let's wait until tomorrow when we look at deontology in its totality. I've just mentioned snippets about it. Now take an example. If I said do unto others as you have them do unto you, that is not always the case. It's not always what we find in the law. I remember that was a law that Pope Francis raised to the Senate, the American Senate, when they were trying to put up a law to stop immigrants from coming into the US. And Pope Francis actually raised to them and told them that all of you here are immigrants. You're not Native Americans. And then he raised them, he said, I remind you of the golden rule, do unto others as you have them do unto you. Now he raised this matter, but to this day, America is doing all it can to keep people out, non-Americans in quotes, out. So in other words, what I'm saying is, it's an ethical theory, but it's not something that is also accepted worldwide. Even a utilitarian point of view was also taken. But let's wait tomorrow when we look at deontology in its totality. Eddie, you have a question or comment? No? Giles?
Thank you, Doctor. Yeah, mine is a general comment or question. In the very beginning, when we started this course, it appeared to be a bit vague and it was not connecting with the course that we are studying. It's now that it's beginning to take shape and beginning to become meaningful in this aspect.
Okay.
In your submission, you indicated that some of the decisions that are made in manufacturing are based on this program, the ethical theories. You
Yes.
mentioned the manufacture of mobile phones and other technological devices.
Yes.
I would like to know if there are any scenarios or in any instances where maybe an ethical expert is employed in a factory to help in decision making of such kind of technological devices. My submission.
Thank you, Giles. One $1 million question would be, what are the ethical values of that business? What are the ethical values of that business? Or even that society, that culture? Take the example of countries like China, which are purely progress and profit-oriented, where you may find there is zero interest in the environment. I don't know if you've heard stories like in some cities in China, where the pollution levels are so high that you see a dark cloud and it's not rain, it's nothing but pollution. Zero interest. Where there are in some cities, you have workers who are working for a bowl of rice, not money that is going to help you pay your rent, pay your hospital bill, but you're simply working for a bowl of rice. That is where you may find even the society values just don't care. So a corporation like that just wouldn't bother about the ethical elements of it. They just wouldn't bother about it. Then you'd find others where maybe religious value. Take an example. Okay, look at examples of universities that are religious founded. UMU, UCU, IUIU. If you went to IUIU, modesty is extremely important. It's extremely important because of the religious beliefs in IUIU. Then go to UCU, where the issues of purity, sexual purity are extremely important, where they will make sure girls sleep on campus as long as they're in their year one. If you get pregnant, you must get married. Those virtues of purity, sexual purity, and so on and so forth, are extremely important to UCU. Come to UMU, where you have ethical values, ethical and social values that are extremely key. Respect for one another, respect for yourself, and respect for others is extremely important. So there you see values where even you'll even have ethical experts coming in. But when it comes to a corporation, and this also, Giles, you have to think about it in this way. Any business that is coming into a market, into a sector, has a right to make profit. That's a right. It has any business that comes into play in any sector has a right to make money. So all actions are geared towards that. However, the social values enforce. There are social values, then there are also legal, the laws. Remember, we said things that enforce ethics, even the legal laws. For example, Uganda might say you do not have workers can only be allowed to work for this number of hours per week or per day, and that law must be enforced. That already is enforcing an ethical value on welfare, on human welfare. They may have a law on minimum wage. They may have a law on healthcare, and so on and so forth. So those emphasize. But for a company to actually employ an ethical expert, that would mean that organization, actually ethics is part and parcel of its business value. So if it is part and parcel of it, then they will do so. If it isn't, they won't bother. They really won't bother. Take an example. I wonder if ethics is even ever discussed in let's say in a government institution of higher learning. Is ethics ever discussed? They may have values maybe on the academic side, but maybe not on the social side. So Giles, that for me would be my answer to your question.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Well comprehended.
Okay. Any other comment or question? Francis, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, just a comment. Most companies, if not all, have ethical values that guide them. In other words, they determine what is right or wrong. So the utilitarian kind of like approach, I don't know which sector or which kind of like, I don't know whether it is really not so much into, it is into kind of like it follows under individuals in the way in which they make decisions. I don't know where you categorize it, because even the government has a constitution which determines the law. So I don't know. I just want you to give me additional perspectives in that direction.
Now, when we look at all the ethical theories, you realize that we see them practically in most. We see them be it in an organization, we see them in our family lives, we see them in our individual lives, all. Now take an example of UMU, which is a Catholic founded institution. You find some decisions will be made based on utilitarianism, some decisions will be made based on deontology, others will be made based on virtue, depending on a case-by-case basis. So take an example. I'll give you an example. At one time, UMU decided that for all its work, all its ICT, the desktop operating systems for all staff and students was going to be open source. In other words, Linux. That was the decision. And the decision that was the reason why it was made, that it was of more ethical value to use open source than Windows, which is pirated. That was the decision. And they went ahead and installed some labs with Linux. And then they went to staff members to install Linux. And all staff members said no. Why? Because Linux is not user-friendly. It is not pleasurable to use. So you realize there, Francis, that deontology value, virtue theory failed to be accepted by end users, especially staff members. I don't know if I make my point clear there.
Yeah, it's a bit clear. It's on a case-by-case basis. Although
Yes.
I don't know what, if you make something on a case-by-case basis, then you may end up violating your own principles.
But that is ethics. There are always arguments. Now, take an example. When we talk about pirated software, there are also we know it's against the law to use pirated software, but there are those who argue that it's unethical to charge poor countries with the licenses to use some of these things. There are those who argue. So with ethics, there are always arguments for and against. There's Techno, I don't know who that is. You are first, then we will have Ogola next.
Yes, this is Lamek. I was just adding something. In our organization where I work for, ethics and integrity is embedded in the core values. We have the mission, we have the vision, and then the core values. Ethics and integrity is part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lamek. I think that's a good one to show. There are those organizations where it's an emphasis. It's part and parcel of your business value. Ogola.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. Mine is really to supplement on what Lamek has said, because I think we had almost related arguments. But mine is mine is more on the policies I think the policies that, because for any organization, when you're maybe joining as a new staff, be it even as a school, as a university, there is usually, of course, a code of conduct that you will have to sign, which kind of tells you that yes, you're coming in, but these are the, the boundaries within which you're supposed to do whatever it is you're supposed to do. Which so I think the policies give a very clear guidance basing on the ethical DNA of an organization.
Okay. Thank you, Ogola. Let me go to the chat room and see. There are different comments. BK measuring, there are different comments, but I think it was all reactions to.
Doctor, I want to say something.
Yes, please.
I think I wanted to respond to the two previous colleagues that have mentioned about ethics being part of the core values. For one, I think I've seen every institution, non-profits, and some of them are profit, and they say that if they put even on the walls, they name it their ethics and integrity, but that is just on paper. But what's the practice? It's all different. You might say it there. It's everything. It's pinned on the wall and on your website, on your brochures, but the practice is different. But I want to still tackle on the point of policies. Policies, as long as they are strengthened, they bring up better ethics. For example, at UMU, for example, you might be using, let's say, Microsoft 365. So 365, all your mails, you're not supposed to change to share mails using your personal email. All your work supposed to be on a drive. There is a policy that is governing for you to be able to access all resources. There is a guiding policy, no flash disks, no what, but everything is followed. So then that causes ethics. There are ethics on the promises and even in the infrastructure. And then there comes integrity, because integrity comes after ethics. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes, Ogola?
Yes, sir, Doctor. Maybe just to complement what BK has just said, I think, in my view, given that integrity it's a very personal thing. So I think the best way really to achieve most of these policy statements, really, what I've seen is really cases where you're able to automate these policy requirements. For example, what BK has just said, maybe it is something automated that you can only access the UMU resources using your username, your student credentials. So you find that it is an automated process, and even if you wanted to deviate, you really don't have any way out. And in my view, I think things like, if you look at things like password change, requirement to change your password maybe for the different platforms in our workplaces. So if you don't automate these things, people are bound to do what comes much easier. What comes easiest to them.
Thank you, Ogola. Do we have any other comment or reaction? No, I think no. So I think what we shall do, let's break off for today. We've had some good discussions here. We shall meet tomorrow and discuss deontology.
What time do we meet tomorrow, Doc?
I think it's 9.
All right, Doc.
Okay, no, thank you.
I'll make sure tomorrow afternoon I pass on the recordings to Emma. The week was a bit busy, but I'll make sure tomorrow afternoon I pass them on to Emma.
All right, Doc. Thank you very much.
Thank you too.